Check. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first symposium on NLP for social good. We have 6 amazing speakers lined up in our symposium. We have 4 talks today, and for tomorrow we have 2 talks. So the talks will cover the topics like NLP applications on healthcare, law, and education, and mental health. So without wasting further time, let's start. One thing I forgot to tell, we have 174 participants registered for the symposium. We are delighted to see so much interest on this NLP for social good symposium. Let's start. Our first talk is on application of law, application of NLP on law. So let's start. Let me first introduce the speaker. So our first talk title is NLP for the legal domain, challenges and opportunities. Our speaker is Saptarshi Ghosh from Department of Computer Science at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. He is an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science in the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. His research interests include law and AI, social media analytics, and algorithmic bias and fairness, on which he presently leads a Max Planck partner group at IIT Kharagpur. He has published more than 80 papers in peer-reviewed conferences and journals. He investigates several research projects funded by government as well as by industry. He was awarded the Institution of Engineers Young Engineer Award 2017-18 in the computer engineering discipline in India. His work has been awarded at top law AI conferences, including the Best Paper Award at Zurich 2019 and the Best Student Paper Award at ICAIL 2021. He is presently the second editor of Legal Information Retrieval for the Artificial Intelligence and Law Journal, the most prestigious journal in law AI. So let's start. Saptarshi is joined. Oh.
Hello, am I audible to the online audience?
Yes, we can. At least I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm assuming that it's audible.
Yeah.
Yes, hello everyone. So I'm Saptarshi Ghosh. I'm an associate professor at IIT Kharagpur, or Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. So I start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this prestigious symposium. And I'm also great to see the audience. So in this talk, I'll be talking about application of NLP in the domain of law. And I have assumed the general NLP, an audience who has general interest in NLP. So I'll introduce the challenges in legal NLP and some background information about the law domain. And then I'll talk about some of the research problems being practiced nowadays in legal NLP. some small issues will be pointed, please don't laugh. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so let me start with some ground information on the legal domain, because that is kind of needed to get some understanding of the energy challenges. So very broadly, the law systems around the world are of two types: civil law and common law. So in civil law, the legal system is mainly dependent on a set of written statutes. So these are called like different acts, sections, and so on. I'll give some examples soon. So that's civil law. There are these written down statutes like the constitutions of a country. So these are the civil law is based on those kind of laws. On the other hand, common law, in common law, whenever an important court passes a judgment, that judgment almost becomes a law. That means in an ongoing case, a lawyer can argue that the situation is similar to a case 10 years back, and at that point, the same court or a higher court had ruled in favor of this party, which is very analogous to my party now. So this time the ruling also could be in my favor. So the past judgment given by an important court of law kind of becomes a law, and you can refer to it in future cases. So that's called common law. So there is this legal term, a Latin term called stare decisis, which that says that similar facts or similar situations should yield similar results. And the whole common law system is based on this principle. And of course, there are many countries which follow a combination of criminal law and civil law. That means they have both written down statutes and the prior cases, prior case judgments pronounced by important courts also become kind of laws which can be referred to. And UK, India, and many other countries actually follow a combination of civil and criminal law. So I am from India and I am in UK, so I'll focus on civil plus common law because that is what is mostly followed in the countries in which we live. Okay. So in this kind of a system, which is a mixture of common law and civil law, there are two, you can say, sources of law or two sources on which the verdict of an ongoing case can depend. One is the statutes. So, for example, in case of India, there is the Constitution, which was drafted in 1950, that contains lots of laws. Also, there are lots of other laws or acts, what we call, like the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973. These are the written laws. Additionally, an ongoing case can also refer to prior cases. Right? So these are the two sources of law in a civil plus common law country. Now, in such a system, there are many types of legal documents. So we are talking about legal NLPs. So what kind of legal text are we talking about? You see, there are lots of legal documents, like the acts or the statutes, which are the written laws, the first information reports. So at least in many countries, when there is a legal situation and a party goes to, say, a police station or a lawyer to file a complaint, this is usually the first legal document that is generated at a police station, the first information report. Then when a case is ongoing, there are lots of intermediate orders, intermediate documents being generated. And finally, at the end of the case, a final judgment is written. It's usually written by the judge, which actually says what is the verdict of the court. Additionally, there are lots of contracts, MOUs, patents, law reports, and many more. Out of these, in this talk, I'll focus on only these two: statutes and prior case judgments. And I'm focusing on these two for a reason. First of all, these are public. These are public documents, which for many countries are publicly available. India, UK, European Union, you name it. These are mostly private, publicly available. Also, because of the importance of these documents, a lot of prior research has focused on this. So that's why I'm going to focus on these two types of documents. I'll give a quick introduction to these documents and then talk about some NLP problems. Of course, when I'm giving the introduction about the documents, we will already start seeing some NLP problems which arise while working with these documents. So first, let's talk about statutes. These are the written down laws. And I've listed a few examples here. You can see Ireland, UK, Immigration and Asylum Act. So all these are typically called acts or sometimes called statutes and so on. So of course, these are like date, they have a particular date on which this act was passed. Now acts can be amended, newer laws come in, and so on. Okay. So usually acts follow a hierarchy, like a research paper. So an act is a whole body. Now the act can be divided into parts. Parts can be divided into chapters. Chapters are divided into topics. And at the leaf level of this tree, we have what are called sections. The sections usually are the laws, the actual laws, which say what is. And the laws can be of different types. Some define a particular crime. Some talk about what is the punishment if someone commits a crime, and so on. So here is an example. Let's say the immigration. Okay. Sorry about this. Can this be closed? So we have this act of UK. Thanks. Okay. So yeah, Immigration and Asylum Act of 1999. This is, you can see what the purpose of the act is. Provisions about procedures in connection with marriage and so on. Now, if you see, these are divided into 10 parts, like part 1, part 2, part 3, up to part 10. Okay, at the end. And again, each part has different sections. So this 44, 45, 46, these are all different sections, which actually define the laws. Okay, this is an example of an act. Okay, another EU act. This is called the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, this act again has, so this is protects the human rights of people in European Union countries. Again, you see, and this, again, as I told, acts can be often extended or amended. So this has been extended through different protocols. So now you have, say, these articles which form the acts. So Article 2, 3, 4. So in total, there are about 14 articles and some amendments. Like these protocols have amended the articles. So these are some examples of acts. Now, as another last example, this is an act from India. This is one of the most famous acts called Indian Penal Code. This defines all the criminal crimes in India. It defines all the crimes in India. What will be the punishments if someone commits the crime and so on. Again, if you see, the act is divided into chapters, like offences affecting the human body, offences against property, and so on. Chapters are divided into topics, and topics are divided into sections. You might think similar sections are grouped under the same topic, and similar topics are grouped under the same chapter, and so on. Now, I'm telling you this just to put a correction to NLP. So, one of the most popular problems in legal NLP is legal statutory identification. That is, given a particular legal situation or the facts of a situation, what are the laws which may have been violated? Or what are the relevant laws to a given situation? This is called legal statutory identification. We will discuss this in a bit more detail later. But there are the two most popular data sets for legal statutory identification are these two. Okay, two of the three most popular. There is another from Chinese documents. But these two are the English documents. The data sets are the English documents. One of the data set uses this ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights articles, which I described. Another uses this Indian Penal Code articles. So this is essentially a multi-class, multi-level classification problem, where given the topic, given the description of a situation, you have to figure out which articles may have been violated. So it's essentially a multi-level, multi-class classification problem. Okay, so this is just to form a bridge between what we were discussing about the legal background and the NLP part. Okay, so this is about the statutes. I'll quickly move to explaining what court judgments look like. So again, this is the court judgment, which is the final judgment pronounced by a court of law after a case. It is usually written by a judge or dictated by a judge and written by a lawyer and so on. Essentially, they contain some metadata or preamble about the case, and then the actual judgment which has been pronounced. Again, one reason of the popularity of these judgments is that they are mostly publicly available. So many courts in many countries actually make the judgments publicly available. And there are laws which say that judgments should be publicly available. So if you see the European Court on Human Rights and the UK Supreme Court, Indian Supreme Court have all made their judgments public. Now, what does the judgment contain? Essentially two broad parts, a preamble and the main text. So the preamble is, and I'm showing you an example from the Indian Supreme Court. The preamble usually gives these information, like which court is deciding this, what is the name of the judge. Sometimes it gives the name of the lawyers, the date when the judgment was pronounced, and so on. So this is the preamble. The rest of the document is actually the main text, and that contains many segments. These are some of the segments which may be contained in the legal case judgment. Say, what are the facts? So the chronology of the events that led to the filing of the case. Then sometimes we are talking about the Supreme, let's say a case running in the Supreme Court of a country. So this case has been heard by lower courts also. And maybe this case is an appeal against the judgment passed by the lower court. So then the Supreme Court judgment will also say what was the ruling by the lower court. Then there will be the arguments by the two contending parties. The lawyers will argue the cases. Some statutes will be cited, some precedents will be cited. Yeah, lawyers will form their arguments based on precedents, based on prior cases. And finally, the judge will explain the decision. So the final judgment is the actual decision, and the ratio is called the rationale. So what is the judge's thinking behind giving this judgment? So that will be explained. So typically these are the sections of segments in our case judgment. These are called rhetorical segments in this video. Just to give an example from the European Court of Human Rights, I'm not showing you the full judgment, and the full judgment can be huge. It can be 100 pages, even 1,000 pages for a complicated case. I'm just showing you some of the headings which will help you to map with these rhetorical segments. So first, the facts are described, right? And then relevant legal frameworks and practice. These are the relevant statutes and relevant case laws are described here. Then, what is the law actually? So the parties, so alleged violation of Article 8 of the Convention and Article 13 of the Convention. If you remember, I talked about legal statute identification. So in this particular example, Article 8 and Article 13 is said to have been violated. Whether it has been violated will be decided by the court. But essentially, the facts of the case seem to have violated these two articles. So if we think of the legal statute identification problem, then this will be a classification problem, and the target methods will be Article 8 and Article 13. So then we have the parties' arguments, the court's assessment. This is the ratio of the decision. The court's assessment. What is the judge's thinking after hearing the arguments of the parties? And finally, we have the judgment. So typically, if you see these segments are contained in these in the case judgment. But the issue is that often these headings are not used. Okay? Often different courts write their documents or judgments very differently. In fact, different judges write their judgments. So the challenge is that case judgments written by in different countries, different judges, they vary a lot. So the style varies. Also, some segment. Okay, I mean logically, all judgments contain those segments. Maybe some few. I mean, small judgments might miss a few segments. But in general, the problem is that the writing style can vary a lot. So often these segments get interleaved. The facts of a case and arguments, sometimes they get interleaved and so on. Also, the section headings that we describe, they are not often, so if you see these headings maybe some of the headings match well to this, facts and facts. But then the headings do not always match with these segments. So it's a challenge to actually match which part of the judgment is matching with which rhetorical segment. So this, writing style varies a lot. So just to give you a couple of examples, say the UK Supreme Court, this is a case of the UK Supreme Court. You see, I hope you can see these headings. Introduction, the law before 1991, the first question, the second question. So then logically those segments are there, but the headings are very different. So it's not quite straightforward to match these headings with, say, which among these is the facts. Maybe the law before that, okay, maybe this part is the facts. But you see the facts heading is not there anymore. or maybe the law before 1991 is the idea. Maybe this is the segment where the judge is talking about some statutes. But again, it's not so clear. The heading says law before 1991. Now, one good thing is at least this document gives some headings and summaries. Let me show you one document from the Supreme Court of India. You go through it. So no headings, nothing. And often you can have like hundreds of pages of such continuous text. Imagine reading a 100-page book which is not divided into chapters, sections, and so on. So it becomes a problem. So this is another important problem in legal NLP. Given a case judgment, map the different sentences or paragraphs to one of these rhetorical segments. So this problem is called rhetorical segmentation or rhetorical role level. Essentially, every sentence or every paragraph of a case judgment, map it to one of these levels. I must tell you one thing. In law, one problem is that things are very non-standardized. And there are different data sets for this problem, rhetorical leveling, but these levels are different in different data sets. Right. So also different courts write their judgments very differently. So, lack of standardization is a challenge in legal NLP. Okay. So that was a brief introduction to types of legal documents, especially statutes and court case judgments. Now let us actually talk about some challenges in NLP. First of all, the documents are very long. Literally, they can be 100 to 500 pages, 1,000 pages long. Now the issue is that, so some statistics here, like average number of words in an Indian Supreme Court judgment is 4,300. But in case of UK Supreme Court, 14,000. Right? UK Supreme Court judgments are much longer. So what's the problem? The problem is that most of the NLP tools that we have out there, NLP models, they are trained over small documents, much smaller documents, like news articles and so on. Those models don't always perform well on such long documents. Especially nowadays we have these. Let's talk about summarization. I'll just talk a bit about that. There are many abstractive models of summarization now, which are very popular. But a big problem is that none of them, all of these models, the neural models, they have a maximum limit on the maximum number of tokens that can be given. Tokens essentially mean words, some subset of words, but essentially there is a token, and the token is right about 1024 for most of the models. So you see, suppose you want to summarize a document, but you cannot fit in the whole document into one. Right? So that becomes a problem. In huge documents, we have to deal with something like chunking and so on. I'll just talk about that a bit. But essentially, you cannot fit a whole document into one of these neural models. So many of these neural models, especially which depend on this attention and all, they have these problems with fitting in long documents. Of course, better models are coming up, like long form model, which can take in long documents, but still it's a problem while dealing with legal documents. Another problem, of course, is the complexity of legal text. So compared to other types of text, legal text is much more challenging and complex. Sentences are huge. Often there are non-standard ways of writing different sentences or different words. To the extent that even identifying the end of a sentence is a challenge. And actually there have been multiple papers on this particular problem. How to detect the end of a sentence. So you might be thinking, I'm exaggerating, how difficult can be in detecting the end of a sentence? It's a full stop. Let me show you one sentence from an Indian court judgment. This is one sentence. First of all, this is 71 words. We usually don't write sentences having 71 words, but that's fairly common in legal text. Also, just look at the number of stops or full stops. I've marked them in red. Hopefully it's visible. You can see this sentence alone has about around 8 full stops. Out of these stops, which stop actually determines the end of the sentence? For a human being, it's often easy, but for NLP tool often it's a challenge to detect which stop ends a sentence. And actually, there have been multiple papers on this. How to detect the end of a sentence in hypertext. Yeah, so sentence boundary detection in legal text. There have been multiple papers on this problem. One of which is this. Another issue, named entity recognition. Often named entities are written in many different ways in legal text. And often standard NER tools do not perform well. So again, I'm showing you examples from two well-known NERs, the Stanford NER and Spacey. So these are two general purpose popular NERs. If you see Life Insurance Corporation of India, this is just one entity. This is the name of a company in India. But if you run Stanford NER, this is what came out. Life was said to be a person, insurance corporation, an organization, and India location. Whereas actually this whole thing should be one organization. Here is another example. Okay, sorry, the text size is, I realize, maybe a bit small. So, if you see, some of them are identified correctly, sure. But if you see, Gulabai Desai is the name of a person. Here it's identified correctly, Gulabai Desai person. But here, only the first name is given, Gulabai. This is being identified as an organization. Okay, so the same name, somewhere it is identified as a person correctly, but somewhere else it is identified as an organization. Also, if you see this name, this is also another person in the case. It's completely missed by Spacey. Spacey doesn't even understand that there is a person name there. Okay. So, of course, some of these problems may be coming due to the tools not being familiar with Indian names. But even if you take examples from European court cases, this problem is known to exist. So again, even name entity recognition in legal text is more challenging than say NER or say news articles or general Wikipedia articles. So NER in legal text is more challenging. Okay. Additionally, there is a lot of variation in the style of writing, as I said. In legal NLP, a big problem is that the lack of standardization. So often the same kind of topic is written very differently by different judges, even in the same court. So yeah, and we have done some work on summarization and briefly describe them. We have seen that algorithms which have been designed for summarization of European cases, they have not worked so well on Indian cases and vice versa. So of course, Indian legal text has a bit more challenge because of the again non-standard way, or as I showed, no section headings and so on. Often when summarizing say European legal text, the algorithms take advantage of the section headings, but those are missing in case of Indian legal text. So I mean the challenges of the summarization algorithms are even larger. Okay, so and another problem is there. It's expensive to build large scale data sets. So apart from legal NLP, I also work on social media text. If we want to build some data sets on social media text, we just go to say another mechanical turk or Crowdflower and then get data annotated. But we cannot do the same with legal text. Normal annotators don't even understand legal text. We also don't understand legal text. So we have to deal with law students, law practitioners, which requires more, expenses, time, and so on. So building big data sets is also an issue. At least like in the last, say 3-4 years ago, there were very few data sets in legal NLP. But over the last 3 or 4 years, as interest in legal NLP has picked up, we are seeing a lot more data sets coming out. So now we have at least several data sets that are benchmarks on legal NLP and so on. Okay. So there are lots of challenges on legal NLP, but that leads to opportunities also. For example, so there are two types of opportunities. One is to design tools for use by law practitioners, like the summarization of a court case judgment, actually helping them to draft a legal documents and so on. Also, there are a lot of opportunities to design tools for common people. The common people don't understand law. So if someone can build a tool to explain to them in simple terms what legal what legal reports can be taken in a situation, that kind of a tool has a lot of impact. And there are lots of startups coming up in legal NLP or legal AI for this reason. If we can develop tools for use by either legal practitioners or common people, there are lots of takers for such tools. Okay, so this was kind of a description of some of the challenges in legal NLP. I shall move on to describing some of the research problems which are popular in legal NLP today. So I have a long list of documents here, long list of research problems here. Of course, I don't have time to discuss all of them, but let me just walk you through this list. This rhetorical labeling we already discussed. This is classifying the sentences or paragraph of judgment according to one of the rhetorical segments. Then we have retrieval of relevant results. This is a very important problem. In a common law system, for an ongoing case, a lawyer has to search for prior cases which are relevant to the current one. So prior case retrieval, PCR, is an important problem. Legal standard identification we discussed. This is given a situation, say a natural language description of a litigation. Identify which laws may have been violated. It's essentially a multi-level, multi-class classification problem. Multiple laws might have been violated in the case, so we need to identify those. Summarization, yes, because case judgments are long, summarization is a big problem. Another very challenging and important problem is legal judgment prediction. So given the facts of a case, can we predict the judgment in some form? Then there are legal citation network analysis too. So it's not only about NLP, graph algorithms can also be used on legal text because legal documents cite each other, and therefore there is a question of network analysis. And then bringing in explainability and other things are also there. So, of course, I don't have time to explain all of these. That would be a very boring talk. Let me describe some of these problems. Let's start with case judgment summarization. So the motivation is clear. Judgments are huge, hundreds of pages long, and even legal practitioners don't always have time to read the full judgment. Therefore, can we build a summary automatically? Challenges are, yes, lengthy, unstructured, dense legal text. So it's the summarization is a challenge. Okay. So as I said, building data sets is also a contribution in legal NLP because very few data sets exist. So in one of our works, we have created these data sets. One is on, or two are on Indian Supreme Court. Last one is very small, so ignoring this. So we have one data set from the Indian Supreme Court. It contains about 7,000 Indian Supreme Court cases, and their summaries written by law practitioners. So if you see, average compression ratio is 0.24. So the summaries are around 1/4 the judgment size. So summaries are relatively larger. The other judgment, the other data set is judgments from the UK Supreme Court. These are published monthly, and there are not, at present, there are not too many judgments on the website that we have seen. So we could get 793 only. So here the documents come with the summaries, but the compression ratio is much larger. So the summaries are just 10% of that. Right. So yeah, all the data sets we have made public. Now, when we have tried different summarization algorithms on these data sets, so possibly it's known that summarization can be broadly of two types. One is called extractive. So here, important sentences are picked from the document, and those important sentences are appended together to form the summary. So essentially, the problem is to identify which sentences are important. This is called extractive summarization. The other way is abstractive summarization, where the summarization model actually tries to understand the legal document and generate a summary. So the abstractive model generates language. So in this slide, I'm showing you extractive algorithms. There are many algorithms which are domain independent. For general summarizing general English text or general summarization algorithms, there are many, both supervised and unsupervised. Also, because legal documents are known to be long and there is a big, demand for summarizing legal documents, many domain-specific summarization algorithms have also been created. So we have applied many of these algorithms and benchmarked their problems with their performance of the datasets. So this slide is about extractive algorithms. Now there are several abstractive algorithms. If you see, starting from very early methods like pointer generator to word sum, BOT, and long is the long format, there are now several abstractive models available. I'm not going into details of any one, but just I would like to point out about these two models, Pegasus and long format. There are legal domain specific versions for them. So these models, the original models, have been fine-tuned on legal document summary pairs, and we have got legal Pegasus and legal long format. So these are available on Hugging Face. You can just download them and run them. So these are actually fine-tuned over judgment summary pairs from US legal courts. Okay, so these documents are usually, these models are usually more suitable for legal document summarization because they have some domain-specific knowledge inbuilt into them. But as I said earlier, the main challenge is that most of these models cannot take in a full document, full legal document. If you see, all these models have some input capacity on the number of tokens that can be given to them. So apart from long format, which is actually meant for really long documents, apart from long format, none of the other models can actually take in a full UK court judgment. Because the UK court judgment is around 14,000 words. So apart from long format, actually long format also fails in some cases. So the maximum length of a UK judgment we found more than 20,000 words. So even for those judgments, long format will also not be sufficient. But apart from long format, the other models would definitely not be sufficient for legal PHI. Of course, there are roundabout ways, not perfect, but roundabout ways. One of which is chunking. That's the most standard way. So divide the documents into chunks, summarize each chunk separately, and then append the summaries. Definitely, this is not a foolproof method or not a very ideal method because of issues like, for example, we kind of here assume that every chunk will have equal importance. I mean, every chunk will have a same length representation in the summary. But actually, it's not the case. Different parts of a case judgment are very important. But those things, they are difficult to incorporate. So this is a standard technique of you just chunk the documents and every chunk you separately summarize and then append the summaries. But of course, there is some loss of information also because the same thing may be repeated in two chunks, then that will be duplicated in the summary. So those things can happen. But anyhow, we have benchmarked several methods, and I'm showing you some of the best performing methods here. You see, these are two extractive methods. GIST is a legal domain specific method, and Samarana is a well-known summarization tool using RNNs. So they achieve scores of around 0.4, 0.2. So compared with this, we have abstractive models like BART and legal Pegasus. These are the two which gave good performances in our experiments at least. If you see, these are these scores are root scores. Root scores are standard evaluation metrics for summarizing them. Root score is between 0 and 1. Higher root score is better performance. So if you see, root scores are slightly higher for abstractive models. Like here 0.493 is the highest, here we have 0.495. Then RuGel is decidedly higher for abstractive models. But then, so this slide implies that abstractive models are a bit better. However, we also saw that this is an automatic evaluation. We also got some law students from India to go through the summaries and tell us how they like the summaries. So they actually preferred the simpler extractive summaries. And that is because abstractive models have some issues. Sometimes because the language generation is involved, sometimes the generated text becomes grammatically a bit incoherent. Sometimes we found one sentence, before ending one sentence, the model starts another sentence. Also, another issue which some of these abstractive models suffer from is called hallucination. Sometimes they tend to generate text which is not there in the input document. I'll give you an interesting example. Say we are using legal Pegasus to summarize an Indian case judgment. Remember, legal Pegasus has been fine-tuned on US court documents. In the summary, often they generate statute names from US, which are nowhere there in an Indian case judgment. Right, so the models have some idea that here a statute name should come, and they have a tendency of picking up statute names which they have seen during training, which were US statute names. But that's clearly not relevant in when summarizing an Indian case judgment. Right. So hallucination is a problem we found in methods like legal Pegasus, which have been trained on US case judgments. So therefore, though the root scores seem to imply that abstractive models are better, in order to make abstractive models good enough for legal document summarization, we'll have to go through some improvements. Something that is not there in the slide, but we are now doing. Now, of course, we know that the large language models are changing the world. So we are currently trying out like ChatGPT and Amazing, all these. So we are seeing less of hallucination. That's the good part. But some problems are there even in summary. So, for example, one very strange example that we observed, we were using ChatGPT, I think, to summarize an Indian legal case judgment. The ChatGPT in the sentence, sorry, the summary generated X, Y, and Z were sentenced to so and so. The issue is that X, Y, and Z were not the parties, not the party. X, Y, and Z were the lawyers who were representing the party. So ChatGPT confused between the names of the lawyers and the names of the actual appellants. And that is because in the source sentence, in the source document, there was a sentence X, Y, and Z for the appellants. So it missed the for. X, Y, and Z for the appellant means it's a legal way of writing X, Y, and Z are the lawyer representing the appellants. But somehow because X, Y, and Z and appellants came in the same sentence, ChatGPT understood they were the appellants. So they wrote, ChatGPT wrote in its summary X, Y, and Z were sentenced to. So actually not the case. The appellants were sentenced to. So these challenges are there. ChatGPT generated good summaries, I must say. And grammatical coherence and all are very good. Though sometimes it also leaves a sentence in between, without completing it and starts a sentence. But even though that's few, ChatGPT, grammatical coherence is good, but still, this final legal points, they sometimes are still confused. So in another example, Supreme Court judgments are often an appeal against a lower court judgment. So the Supreme Court judgment Supreme Court was arguing about a judgment in one of the high courts in India. ChatGPT continuously confused between which court had said what. So maybe the High Court, Bombay High Court had said this is not valid. The Supreme Court is now saying that is valid. But in the summary, it was nowhere clear that which court is telling what. Kind of ChatGPT did not possibly understand the fact that two courts are involved. Right, so in the summary became inconsistent. In one line it was said this is valid. The next line it just said it is not valid. But these were actually the judgments given by two different courts, which were missed. So these final legal points are still to be understood. Okay, so yeah, you can see our data sets and get more details from our papers. I'm guessing the slides will be made available. No, fair. Okay, okay, not much time left. I will quickly pass on to this section. So as I said, Legal judgments cite other legal judgments. These are the precedents which are relevant. Also, they cite statutes. So essentially, this is an example. Let's say, this is whole extract is from a Indian Supreme Court judgment. If you see, this judgment has cited other judgments, prior cases, and also cited statutes. Section 300 of the IPC, Section 304 of the IPC, IPC being Indian Penal Code. So now that we have citations among documents, we can have a citation network, right? So a citation network is another way of modeling this legal knowledge. So here, if you see, this is a simpler citation network where we have these nodes are the vertices of the documents, the case judgments, and they cite each other, which are the links. So this is the citation network which was used for a long period of time. There are several analyses on legal citation networks. We have proposed that this network is not capturing the full picture because the statutes are not there. These are only the case judgments. So in one of our works, we have formulated a more complex citation network. This is actually a hierarchical heterogeneous citation network. If you see, these are the statutes. If you remember, we discussed the statutes have a hierarchy within them. So these are the statutes. Documents are citing statutes. Also, statutes can cite each other. That's perfectly normal. Statutes can cite each other. So all those relationships are captured in this citation network. Yeah, again, you can, I'm not going into details of the citation network, but you can read about the citation network more in our papers. And the last problem that I will talk about is this: legal judgment prediction and legal statutory. These are very popular problems in legal. Essentially, these are classification problems, but with some twists. Let's see. So, LJP, legal judgment prediction, is automatically predicting the outcome of a case given the facts. So, the input is a natural language description of the fact. The output is the outcome. What should be the outcome? Can we predict it? So what does outcome mean? Different variations of, or different research groups have tried different variations of this LJP problem. Some papers have tried to predict the outcome of an appeal. So let's say it's a bail appeal. Someone is appealing to get bail. So it's a binary classification, whether it will be accepted or rejected. Some people have tried to predict the term. That means if there is a punishment, what will be the term of the punishment? Some people, again, and some people have tried to identify the relevant law articles. That means which are the laws which may have been violated. Because often the term of punishment, etc., depend on that. Suppose if someone has, of course, I mean, the seriousness of the crime will depend on which laws are getting violated. And accordingly, the term of punishment will be decided. Now, this last variation, this is also called legal statute identification. Because by itself, this problem is quite challenging. Which are the articles that will be violated? So there are many papers which have studied these problems. These are some of the popular data sets which exist. So there is this European Court of Human Rights data set. So this is part of a benchmark which is called Lex Glue. I guess most of you know about the Glue benchmark, which is for natural language generation and understanding. Lex Glue is the legal version of that. So there are about 5 or 6 legal classification tasks in Lex Glue. So one of the tasks is this legal statute identification task, where if you remember, towards the beginning of this talk, we discussed the European Court of Human Rights. I gave some examples. So essentially, there are 14 articles in this act. So it's a 14 class classification problem. But of course, every input can have multiple levels because multiple acts could have been violated in this situation. There is one dataset from China, the KL dataset, cases from China judgments online. The number of classes is much larger, 183 criminal laws, and also contains labels for charge and penalty declaration. These are the 2 datasets from India. So this has been prepared by a group from IIT Kanpur, and this has been done by us. So these are again datasets for identifying the levels of our judgment. I'm going to give you an example from this Indian legal static identification dataset. So here we have considered the Indian Penal Code, which is an article or a section, which is an act. That act has several sections, out of which we considered the 100 most frequently cited sections. I'm showing you some of these. So let's say 299 is culpable homicide, 307 attempt to murder, and so on. Right? So these sections are the class levels. So yeah, this is a multi-class, multi-level classification problem, but these sections are the levels. Now, given the facts of a situation, we need to identify which are the sections which have been violated. So here is an example. You don't need to read the whole thing. Essentially, this is a description of a situation where some people came with weapons and then they attacked some people, some other people tried to intervene, they are also attacked, and so on. So this is the whole situation which has led to the filing of a case. And these two acts, according to our gold standard, these two sections have been violated. Section 324, voluntarily causing hurt by dangerous weapons or means, and section 302, punishment for murder. Now, if you observe carefully, there are certain parts of this input. So this is the input, and this is the intended output of this problem. One issue is that much of this input is actually noise. This just tells a story essentially. Who came in the morning, armed with so many things, then this person was attacked, that person intervened, he was also attacked, and so on. The most relevant parts, or the only relevant parts, are this. This part says that they came to armed with lathis and parsis and so on. So this is voluntarily causing hurt by dangerous weapons or means. This part indicates the violation of this law, of this section. And towards the end of this is actually said that the person attacked were dead. That then leads to violence or punishment for murder. If the person had not died, then this section would not have been relevant. Only the first section would have been relevant. Right, so different parts of the input actually are telling which sections or which laws are relevant. Okay, so now there are many studies on legal static identification, not going into details, but essentially most of the prior studies, what they have done is they have tried to encode the text, the input text, and the text of the statutes. They have tried to encode them in some way, and then match between the text of the input text, the situation, and the acts or the text of the sections. So essentially, this is a text classification problem. We kind of came out with the idea of also utilizing the network structure. So, if you remember, a few minutes ago, we described that acts have a hierarchy and sections, documents cite sections cite each other. So that essentially there is a complex network also. So and this network I showed you, this is the simplified version of that network. If you see chapters contain topics contain sections, so you can have these links. And also facts cite these sections and so on. So the problem is a text classification problem. Given the input, find out which levels were validated, which sections were validated. So we map that to a graph problem. We consider this kind of a network, and then we model this as a link prediction problem in this network. Essentially, we are trying to figure out a new fact which is coming, which of these sections will it link to or cite to. Essentially, we map this to a link prediction problem over this complex heterogeneous network. And that's gave bit of better results. Though I must say that, in our own work, that those results have been improved now using better text encoding methods. But yeah, this was a novel problem, a novel solution where a text classification problem was not to a graph problem, link prediction problem. So if you're interested, please refer to our AAAI 2022 book. Okay, so I have more or less found just 2 more minutes, just to talk about some future directions. First of all, explainability is a big issue still. So if we really want law practitioners to apply, AI methods or NLP methods, the methods need more explainability. One of the recent SEL papers have shown that for tasks like legal judgment prediction, if you think of attention-based methods to figure out which part of the text a model is attending to while saying whether a bail application will be rejected or accepted, the part of the text where it is attending to is not the part where experts look. So this study from my some of my collaborators, they actually showed those same judgments to some law students and law experts and told them which part do you focus on while deciding whether this bail application will be accepted or rejected. The law practitioners talked about some different questions, which were different to where the models were. So the explainability part is still this. That's a big issue in legal NLP or legal AI. Second is, of course, the emergence of large language models. It is changing many things. It will also change law. So, in fact, some papers have already seen that simpler legal applications, models like ChatGPT are doing well. So, if you, you might know there is a US. So, the exam which someone has to give in the US for becoming a lawyer is called the US Bar exam. That's a set of MCQs, multiple choice questions. Basically, a recall-based task. There, ChatGPT actually performed well. It passed the US Bar exam. So, ChatGPT can become a lawyer. But that was a simple recall-based MCQ kind of task. Some people also tried it out on this Lex Glue benchmark, which I talked about. Lex Glue is a much more challenging data set, where understanding of the legal text is included, is needed. So there actually ChatGPT performed very well. Right. So yeah, it's fascinating that ChatGPT without any further training can do at least some legal NLP applications. But the more complex one, it is still far away from it. Similarly, I told about summarization. It does give good coherent summaries, but the final legal points, it often confuses our business. And finally, thing is, there are some ethical aspects to it. Like, would you, just say, suppose someday legal judgment prediction becomes excellent, 90% correct. But should an AI model be used to judge anyone? So there are lots of these ethical questions also. Like what guarantees should a legal AI model be in order for it to be used? You may have heard of many controversies again in US. Like so there was actually a system which I forgot the name of the system, which was actually used to decide whether someone can get bail or not. But there was a lot of controversy over the system because it was alleged and kind of also shown that tool was biased against certain demographic sections. Right. So there is a lot of controversy because these are decisions which can change the life of a person, whether the person will get a bail or not. So if there are concerns of bias and unfairness there, then that's a big issue. While classifying whether it's a cat or a dog, if the model results its classification, nothing much happens. But in this kind of a decision, whether a person should get bail or not, and so on, this can be a big issue. Okay, so I'll end my talk there. It's just a summary. Thanks to all for hearing. If you have any questions, observations. I'm going to organize this spot.
We have one question online.
Yes, so first we'll have the physical audience have their questions. Yes. And I would request the virtual audience to put in their questions in the chat box. Yes, sir, please. Yes.
Okay, so the first question relates to the last part of your talk, just the last piece of it. You are talking about the ethical aspects of this model, but that is not the real problem. That is not the ethical aspect. The problem is that the systems will be only one or two. So you don't have the possibility of changing the person where you refer to in order to be judged. So that's the point. It's not really the ethical issues related to this artificial intelligence judge because we can have similar ethical issues related to judges, okay? But you have judges, you have plural. There is a plural part of the part. So I would not focus too much on the ethical issues. I would focus on the fact that there is only one or two or three systems that will run the judgments. So just it's not a question. Sorry, it's not a question.
Thanks for the comment. I agree. Even human judges can have their biases. In fact, that was the point about 5 to 6 years back. It was thought that humans will be biased, but how can an algorithm be biased? But then it was seen that because of training, I mean, what happened during training and all, where algorithms can be biased. So I do take your point. I mean, but of course, I mean, see, I mean, there is no end of. We can create many judgment prediction systems also, right? But still, I mean, even if we, I mean, even if we create hundreds legal judgment prediction systems, which can be done, there are lots of economics. So, but even then, there will be this issue that, I mean, of course, this is related to the explainability. A human judge can explain why he or she gave this judgment. An AI model usually does not give very good explanation, still it. So, I mean, sure, I mean, I do take your point. So, yeah, I mean, the issues are there.
Maybe I can do another question.
Yes, you can, please.
So the other question is a little bit more technical and related to what you say, which is summarization, and it's just a curiosity. In your data set, have you produced one summary for each judgment? Because I'm Italian, and from the Italian court, there are many summaries with respect to one judgment. And in that case, there is another issue to deal with. And another point is that abstractive summarization in that case is really not used, because it is better to use extractive summarization in the sense that even who is doing the summary, people who are doing the summary, they are obliged to use extractive summarization and not to change the words of the code. So
to answer your question,
how do you deal with this fact that you have many summaries?
so there are multiple questions here. First of all, I completely agree to you that summarization given by humans is a subjective process. So no two humans will possibly write the same summary. So ideally, a dataset should have multiple summaries. The issue is that in both the Indian Supreme Court site and the UK Supreme Court site, only one summary is given. So while building the dataset, we had to depend on that. There was a third smaller dataset about which I did not speak. There we actually got 2 law students to write the summary, but given the time we could only get 50 articles.
Maybe we take that offline, but in the Italian court, you have different summaries of different points of the final decision. So
that's a good point. I look up to it. Yeah. And the other thing is, so for example, I agree that possibly, I mean, in some countries maybe the summaries written are extractive, but again, in case of Indian and UK Supreme Court, the gold standard summaries are also abstractive. Especially the UK Supreme Court, their summaries are meant to be, used by the general public. So they say that these summaries are simplified versions of the cases, which can be even accessed by the public. So that's why they are abstractive.
Yes, Utkar.
So you mentioned about various aspects regarding legal entity and where it looks in. Is there a specific field of research for appeal analysis wherein appeal is coming against the verdicts passed by the court, being analyzed by large language models and then being transmitted to Supreme Court for further analysis? As in Supreme Court of India roughly gets 7,000 petitions a year. So is there a large language model which can actually filter out the ones which doesn't have any legal precedent and it's completely new and it requires the attention of Supreme Court?
So your question is, suppose an appeal comes to the Supreme Court, the model will figure out whether
which should be
Sent to
suitable
Supreme
for,
Court or not,
the
right?
Whether the court should ever look at it.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, no, but that's a very good idea. If that can be done, fine. But again, you see, those aspects will come up, like suppose the model says this appeal should not even be seen by the Supreme Court. Then someone might be deprived. So that's why, I mean, we can always go ahead and model. But whether it will be actually adopted by the court of law, that's a question. What if the model is consequence? So till then, I don't think any court would do that. There would be a human, checking whether this is should be admitted. But yeah, that's a very good. I mean, if such a data set can be built, then that would be a very good.
We have a question from an online audience. It says that as an ML developer working on legal document ML modeling, how do you address the challenge of incorporating domain knowledge into these models? Specifically, to what extent is it crucial for you to possess a deep understanding of laws and their interpretations? Do you collaborate with legal practitioners or subject matter experts during the development process? And if so, how significant is their involvement in building these models?
That's an excellent question. So, who asked that?
It's by
Uh,
Amarjeet Kawar.
Okay, so Amanjeet, that's a very excellent question. Again, there are two questions here. First of all, how is domain knowledge incorporated? I must say that is not very, like foolproof methods of doing that. Standard method would be to like fine-tuning models on user data. For example, we have seen that say summarization models which are not fine-tuned on user data, they give worse summaries than models which have been fine-tuned on user data. So like fine-tuning on domain-specific data is one way. The other way is to, put some extra things in the objective function of a ML model so that it can incorporate domain knowledge. But yeah, there is no very systematic or foolproof way of doing that. That's our ongoing research also. The other point of your question is the involvement of domain experts in developing these models. That's again a very interesting and essential question. So at least in one of our summarization models, we actually built one of the summarization model for which we took into account the law practitioners. So that, you can read the citation of the paper is there in the slides. The model is called DEL-SUM. So there we actually asked the law practitioner how to even summarize a document. And that's that we look into these different segments, just the importance of different segments, and each segment should have a representation in the summary. So we actually developed a integer linear programming based method, where they could tune. There are different parameters which the law experts could tune, like which sentences were important or how to identify which words were important. They could tune these parameters, and based on that, summary would be generated. But yeah, I agree that say for this particular algorithm, we we developed this along with the legal experts, but often more complicated models, like say these neural models, legal judgment prediction models. That it's a challenge to actually incorporate human knowledge in those kind of models. And that's ongoing research.
So I think we are running out of time. There is another question, but I think Saptarshi can answer that online in some way.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We can take it up later. He's here already.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Saptarshi Ghosh, for an excellent and enlightening talk for all of us. Thank you. We'll take a 10-minute break and we'll start from 11:15.
So we have some refreshments towards there in the lab. Okay, one of us. That is something.
Hello, Dr. Mrinmaya, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you all.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Thank you. We can hear you too. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you.
So we can see you too. Yeah. We can hear you and as well we can see you properly.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir, for coming. Thanks means a lot. Can you see us?
Let's see.
Yes. Can you see us, sir?
Just one quick thing. I need to set up my screens a little better. Yes, I can see you now.
Thank you.
When are we starting?
Dr. Mrinmaya will start in about 5 minutes because the physical audience is left for a tea break. So I'm so sorry for that.
No problem. All good.
Yes, Dr. Mrinmaya will start in just 2 minutes. So dear all, we are going to start the next talk. So joining us online from ETH Zurich is Dr. Mrinmaya Sachan. So Dr. Mrinmaya Sachan is an assistant professor of computer science at ETH Zurich. His research is in the area of natural language processing and the interface of machine learning and education. He has received several awards for his work, including an outstanding paper award at ACL 2015, an IBM PhD fellowship, the Cyber Scholarship, and the CMU CML Fellowship. His current research is funded by grants from the Swiss National Science Foundation, the ETH Zurich Foundation, amongst many others. In today's talk, Dr. Sachan is going to describe some of his group's effort in NLP for social good, particularly in the field of education, where he is going to cover his recent work on leveraging large language models to support education in various ways. Thank you, Dr. Sachan, for placing this event. Over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks a lot for coming, and I'm very excited to be here. Natural language processing for social good is very close to my heart, and I'm extremely excited to tell you about some of the work we'll be doing in our lab on natural language processing for educational technologies. It's a new and upcoming area, but I hope by the end of this talk, I'll be able to convince you that there are a lot of opportunities in this field and a lot of new challenges, both for NLP as well as education technologies. So you should maybe consider contributing to this effort. Okay, so I'll begin talking about large language models. Large language models are clearly one of the most important developments of our times. Language models like ChatGPT are all around the news, and they have brought the field of NLP and AI more broadly fair and square in our public conscience, right? And we are now having this deluge of news, like how ChatGPT is being used to make important legal decisions, how it has kicked off an arms race, how it has now learned to code or maybe blog or to argue. So there are clearly lots of opportunities here. So with the advent of these models, of course, the opportunities of NLP in society are clearly endless, and we are beginning to see a lot of new tools that are coming up that are using natural language processing technologies in more and more high-stakes settings, right? Some good and some maybe less good application settings. So one domain with immense social importance that I am particularly interested in is education. So of course, we have seen this growing popularity of language models, but at the same time, over the last couple of years, we've gone through the pandemic, right? And the pandemic has brought with it a lot of changes in education. We've seen this rise in e-learning platforms. And as more and more of this communication in these platforms in which students are learning is now through language and speech, there is clearly now a great opportunity for NLP in education. These large language models have today clearly emerged as these fantastic general purpose problem solvers. And these language models like GPT-3 or ChatGPT or GPT-4 or whatever is the new upcoming model coming up soon, they are showing a lot of promise in solving very challenging educational problems which require a lot of nuanced forms of reasoning. So here is a plot that you may have come across from the GPT-4 paper. So here, this plot shows the performance of GPT-4 on a number of standardized exams. So as per this plot, you can already see that in about 16 out of 26 exams, GPT-4 is better than the 80 percentile test taker. So these tests are across a wide range of subjects. This includes the bar exam, the AP macro and microeconomics exam, exams in biology, statistics, the LSAT exam, the SAT math exam, exams about the US government, history, environmental science, you name it, right? This is quite impressive, and this has really entered our public conscience today. So this change in NLP has brought a lot of hope that language models like ChatGPT, for instance, can be the next big thing in learning and education, and can potentially bring about a lot of transformative positive change. But at the same time, we also know that there are lots of issues here. This ChatGPT, for instance, has sparked fears on how ChatGPT can be a plague upon the educational system as there is today. Okay, so there are, needless to say, there are lots of positive opportunities, and there is an opportunity for us to have positive transformation in the society. So in this talk, I will try to focus on some of these opportunities, and I'll try to give you a taste of what can be done. So clearly, there are a lot of opportunities for benefiting from these models in education. For instance, we can imagine these models providing intelligent tutoring assistance to students, for example, by generating exercises. They might be used to explain solutions to these problems to students, or they might provide some kind of automated assessment or feedback. These models can potentially also be used to support teachers in various ways. For example, in training teachers, these models can also help teachers in the classroom maybe save time, as they might, for instance, learn to work with these models. They can use them for planning out their lessons, or maybe generating daily quizzes or exercises. These are just some of the use cases that I could immediately think of. However, if you begin to really look deeper into what is happening with these models, you can find that these models are also lacking in several ways. And there are several fundamental challenges in natural language processing that we must actually overcome before we can use these systems realistically in such a high-stakes setting like education. For instance, these models clearly are not very interpretable. It is very unclear how GPT-4 arrives at the solution to such a problem. It's very unclear if the model is really truthful. There's no way for us to assess truthfulness. These models can give us misleading answers, and that is clearly a problem in education. For instance, just the other day, I used ChatGPT and asked it a bunch of questions. I asked it, what is 11 plus 23? And it said, it responded correctly. The sum of 11 and 23 is 34. But then I said, isn't it 26? And the model said, I apologize for my mistake in my previous response. You are correct. The sum is indeed 26. Thanks for bringing it to my attention. So this is clearly the sort of the root of the problem in using these models in educational settings. Then these models are miscalibrated. Even when they are wrong, they continue to be overconfident about their answers. So there is no way to even gauge how confident a model is about its answer. And finally, these models really do not show the kind of pedagogical nuances that teachers show in the classroom. They do not show the nuances, they do not model the nuances of, say, one-on-one human tutoring in the classroom. For instance, very recently, our group has shown that these models can just readily give away the solution to these problems to students. And that's not a good way of teaching students. So this is sort of these are a couple of questions that our group is most interested in. We've been thinking about how can we improve and how can we use these rather imperfect, but definitely very powerful models in high-stakes settings, particularly education. And how can we make these models more pedagogical? How can they model these kinds of nuances in the classroom? So, throughout this talk, I plan to give you essentially a high-level overview of the sum of our research in this area. So here is the roadmap for this talk. I'll divide what I have to present in essentially two parts. So I'll first talk about some of our work on educational question generation. and how we can controllably allow teachers to generate questions, maybe that are catered best to students. And then in the second part of this talk, I'll talk about how we can use these language models possibly for tutoring and what are the challenges that show up when we try to do that. And in particular, I'll talk about a couple of approaches there with respect to Socratic sub-questioning and dialogue-based tutoring approaches. Okay, so let's get started. So let's begin by talking about educational question generation. So we have all been in the classroom, or we have already taught in the classroom. And based on our experience, we can already understand that creating high quality questions in educational context is actually very challenging. Generating high quality questions requires a lot of subject matter expertise. Teachers typically go through a very rigorous, maybe editorial process when they are designing questions. They exercise a lot of precise control over what are the didactic concepts that are to be tested by these questions. They verify these questions, vet them very carefully. And finally, even in order to be really useful in educational contexts, teachers need to be able to have this kind of control in creating questions. Okay. Second, these good questions, what really makes a good question also depends on the students, of course, right? A good educational question should be customized to the student. So here is this, at the bottom of your screen, you see this famous diagram from Vygotsky and his theory of the zone of proximal development, where he puts forward this theory of what is potentially a good question. So here, learning scientists say that a good question is one that challenges the student enough, but hopefully not too much, right? So the good question must be something that the student can maybe do with some help or maybe with some deep thinking, but it should not be obviously trivial to them, and it should not be completely beyond their abilities at this point of time. So good questions should also be personalized. They should be tailored to what is the current knowledge state of the student, and being able to do this with language models is actually quite challenging. So if you think about some of the past work in question generation in NLP, for instance, there's been a lot of work on the SCORE data set. They tend to take this kind of an approach where they define, say, what is a trigger for this question, what is the relevant key phrase or answer that you want to generate a question about. They might select some kind of content based on this, on the answer, what may be some set of sentences which contain this key concept. And then finally, they would construct this question, maybe based on some kind of syntactic transformations, maybe some template-based approach, semantics-based approach, or maybe an entirely end-to-end neural system. So there's clearly been a lot of this work. But in education, if you really think about using these questions and allowing teachers to use this kind of a system, we need to allow teachers more control over the problem features. Teachers should be able to define and determine, for instance, what difficulty of the problem they are planning to generate, what is the maybe topic of the question, or what kind of pedagogical concepts they want to actually judge or test using this question. For instance, what is the underlying math concept that is involved here? So I'll begin by talking a little bit about some of our recent work on controllable educational question generation. This work by Ying Jiao will appear at the AI Ed conference later this summer. And in this work, we tackle this task of generating a math word problem, which is a slightly modified version of maybe a seed math word problem. And this is a very realistic setting in the classroom where the teacher, if they gave a question to a student and the student answers this question incorrectly, they might want to change the question a little bit. They might want to change, for instance, the scenario in which the question is grounded, but they want to still be able to test the student on the same maybe underlying math concept. So our question generation model operates here based on a set of knobs that we provide to these teachers to have more control over the generation process. For instance, we have knobs like what is the target difficulty of the question, what is the topic of the target question, and what is maybe the underlying solution of the problem. Maybe we wish to just generate a problem whose solution is basically the same, right? So this is the setting that we are going to work with. And methodologically, we draw, in order to build a model for controllable educational question generation, we draw some inspiration from some previous work here by Mirish Kala and others in 2022. What they do here is they propose essentially an energy-based model for text generation. In this formulation, they essentially propose defining an energy function, which defines a probability distribution over the space of possible text sequences in this way. And then they use a Metropolis Hastings-based sampler to sample text sequences from this energy function. I will not go into the details of precisely this method, but one can, and you can read this if you are interested. But here is what we do, right? In our case, we define this energy function as a combination of a set of expert models. So these expert models, what they're doing is essentially they are measuring several factors of goodness of questions, of question quality. For instance, we have one factor here, the first one, which measures the similarity of the predicted solution of the generated problem with the solution of the original problem, the problem that the teacher originally had. Then we have expert modules like what is like a topic classification model that determines the topic of the question. Then we have a language model that is measuring the fluency of the generated question. And finally, we have this fourth expert model, which is measuring essentially the BERT score or the Hamming distance between the original question and the finally generated question to make sure that the generated question is not too far off from the original. So the specifics of this might vary depending on what kind of control features you might want to exert. But as in this previous work from Mirish Kala, here what we do is we use a Metropolis Hastings sampler where we iteratively sample word level edits from this energy model. And we incorporate a lot of these problem features by defining essentially the energy function from which the model is sampling. We additionally incorporate what is the design problem's difficulty level by deciding to accept or reject samples based on word level difficulty measures coming from a database of age of acquisition of words. So age of acquisition is essentially the age at which a child typically acquires this particular new word. So the sample is accepted if the net age of acquisition of the sentence is in some desired difficulty range that the teacher may be requesting. Okay. So here's this is a simple model, and we evaluate this on the math QA data set. So this data set essentially contains a set of elementary level math questions, which can be typically solved within 4 steps. And the data set comprises of basic questions and some advanced questions. And there are also some splits of the data set in terms of what topic the question is on. So there's a set of topics, like the same question is written in the daily scene. There's a variation of the question about money and physics and so on. So we conducted a range of automatic as well as human evaluations on the quality to assess the quality of our generated questions. Here I'm showing you just the human evaluation. And we found that our model outputs actually better questions than any of the previous baselines on a number of metrics that we are measuring here. So for instance, here we are measuring well-formedness of a question. The raters are measuring topic match to the target topic, solvability, how solvable the question is, is it correct essentially? And we also measure what is the creativity of this question. And on all of these parameters, essentially our models on a couple of settings does better than the previous work in this area as per human evaluation on these criteria. So then what we did is we presented these questions. So we recruited some math educators directly via Upwork, and we asked them a set of questions, right? So we asked them, can you differentiate between human-generated questions? So this is the plot on the left. Can you differentiate between human-generated questions and computer-generated questions? And the second question that we asked them is basically corresponding to the plot on the right, where we asked them if they would use the same question directly in their classroom, or they would maybe use it with some slight modifications, or they would not use it. So when we asked them these questions, we found that the teachers rated about 80 to 90% of the model-generated questions as human-generated. And they found that over 90% of the outputs of the generated questions can be used either directly or with some minor modifications in high school settings, in primary and high school education. So essentially, these models are already quite powerful. So they are actually able to generate questions that are already quite good and maybe potentially useful. So there's a lot of room for improvement, of course. So in summary, in this part of the work, what we did is we proposed an approach for generating math word problems with some set of teacher-controlled parameters. In this work, we particularly explored the difficulty level of the question, topic, or the underlying math equation that is involved in solving it. So this is, in my view, an interesting area of research where it would be interesting to study at some point if we could think about what are other ways in which teachers want to controllably generate educational questions, and how we can give them this kind of opportunity. Okay, so next I want to move on and talk about a refinement of this approach, where we consider this problem of adaptive educational question generation. So the key problem here is that if you think about good educational questions, they should be personalized to the students. In particular, good questions should be personalized, should be based on the student's prior knowledge. It should also be based on their individual, maybe learning styles and their differential learning capabilities. So personalization is a key problem in education, and a lot of educational platforms, for example, Duolingo, already employ personalization. So for instance, when you are learning a second language in Duolingo, within each lesson, Duolingo decides which exercises to give you based on maybe the words or the concepts the app believes you need to practice. Okay, and personalization has a lot of benefits. For instance, personalization has shown to improve learning outcomes. Personalization has also been shown to lower dropout rates in these MOOCs and increase instructor satisfaction overall. So here is a high-level schematic of what a typical such an adaptive educational system, say in Duolingo, looks like. Such an adaptive system comprises of basically three parts. So for instance, on the left, you have this learner model. So the learner model, or also sometimes called the student model, what it does is it essentially dynamically tracks the knowledge of the learner during the course of learning. So its objective is to essentially keep tracking what the student is doing and building an understanding of what the student knows and what the student doesn't know. Then such a system has a domain model, which is this box at the bottom of this figure. And the domain model, its job is essentially to maintain the knowledge of the domain of the subject area, for instance, that you're trying to tutor the student about. And then we have a kind of an adaptation model, which is also called a pedagogical model. And this model, what it is doing is it is deciding on what is the teaching strategy we should be employing here. For instance, what is the content that I should be presenting to the student, or what question should I be presenting to the student based on the learner profile as well as the learning material that I might have had. So this is how a typical adaptive educational question generation educational system looks like. However, there are a number of bottlenecks here. So a lot of previous approaches for personalized learning tend to have a fixed set of pool of exercises or learning material. And this is quite laborious, and this is actually usually prevents these systems and these models for bringing basically the capabilities of generative AI for adaptive education. So in the second piece of work, what we did is we think about how we can combine both these ideas into one question generation system that generates questions adaptively to the student. So here's how it works. So I'll give you first a quick introduction on what such a learner model might look like. So a popular approach for modeling learners is what is called knowledge tracing. And the goal of knowledge tracing here is to estimate the student's mastery, time-varying mastery over what are called a set of skills or knowledge components based on all the questions and responses to those questions historically, right? So for each student, a knowledge tracing model is basically trying to build this kind of students' time-varying mastery over a set of predefined skills. And there is a lot of work in this area, and there are models based on some variations of logistic regression or probabilistic models or deep knowledge tracing models, which use deep nets as well. So what we do here is we try to come up with an approach of adaptively generating questions by combining this knowledge tracing model with a controlled text generation model. So here is our specific problem framing. In particular, we are focusing on generation of a set of translation exercises. So these translation exercises are often used, for instance, on Duolingo, where students are asked to translate a sentence in English to the other language in which they are learning. And so here is the problem specification. We assume that we are given basically the student's learning history. So this is h less than equal to n. We know what the exercises they have attempted so far, what their responses to these exercises are. So each exercise here is a sequence of words, and we know per word correctness labels. So we know per word which word the student has got correctly and which word the student did not get correctly. So we know this information. And our goal is to essentially generate the next exercise that we should give to the student to practice, given the student's dynamic knowledge state, which is estimated from this knowledge tracing model. So we consider the way we set this problem up is we consider a set of system parameters. For instance, a set of what are called knowledge components that should be the next exercise. These are essentially a set of translation words that must appear in the next question. This is designed by the system. And the other thing that we assume here, the other system parameter, is the expected difficulty of the exercise. Okay, so this is this thing called dn+1, which is again a pre-specified system determined parameter, and it could come up based on some ideas we might have on how we want to work with the student. We want to challenge them by maybe a difficulty level that is just above their knowledge state. So we define this expected difficulty of a new exercise, dn+1, as the expected number of errors that they might make according to our knowledge tracing model on this new exercise that we might have generated. So this is the problem setup. So here's how our model looks like. So we are given students' latest, we are given a set of historical learning data for each student. We use this learning history to basically generate students' knowledge states. This is a vocabulary dimensional vector for each student. So for each student, this vector judges as has an assessment of what the student knows. Have they mastered which word in this vocabulary or not? Then we combine this, we use this knowledge, the knowledge state of the student, and we combine this with some system determined parameters, such as the difficulty of the next question, dn+1, or maybe some other constraint that the system designer might set up to generate an exercise. So this is the next exercise that will be posed to the student. And then once we generated this next exercise, this exercise will be updated, and the student historical data will be updated based on the student's response to this newly generated question. So the way we train this model is we have essentially this knowledge tracing model that is trained using a prediction loss, basically loss defined in terms of these word level correctness labels that we have from historical data. The exercise generator on the right, this is a typical text generation loss, basically where we optimize for the probability of the next word given previous word. In addition, we have this inconsistency loss where we are training both the knowledge tracing model as well as the exercise generation model jointly. And this model, this loss, what it is saying is that it is trying to essentially get the two models to agree. It is penalizing for disagreement between the knowledge tracing model, what it is saying about the newly generated exercise, and the exercise generation. Okay, so I'll maybe skip some of the modeling details here. And I'll directly begin to talk about this inconsistency loss. I imagine this is the one bit that is new here. So this inconsistency loss, what it is doing is that it is making sure that the generated exercise is at the requisite difficulty that the teacher or the system designer has stated. So this inconsistency loss says that the difficulty of the generated exercise using the knowledge state of the student should be as close to the input difficulty D as possible. So this is basically the same equation as the objective function we had described earlier, where we have this loss term, which is saying that D should be close to should be basically the same as the expected error rate of the student when they answer this particular question. Okay, so once we have trained this joint model, we can decode exercises from this language model. So the standard approach for decoding from a language model essentially is beam search, right? And in beam search, we have this heuristic search algorithm that is exploring this graph of all possible generation sequences by expanding at each point of time the most promising node only into a limited set of k-nodes, right? So here is this thing written down mathematically, where the beam at a time point t, yt, is achieved by taking the beam yt minus 1 corresponding to the previous time step and keeping only the top k possible candidates for future consideration. Now, in addition, in this setting, we have a set of constraints. So we have this constraint decoding setup, where we want to respect the constraints that we want maybe certain words to always appear in the problem, and we want the sentence to be of a particular difficulty. So the way we handle this is, one way to handle this is by incorporating essentially some kind of a distance to constraint satisfaction in the beam search objective. For instance, we can include distance to satisfaction of the set of words that must appear in the problem. This is this term FC. And the other term is essentially the term that is saying that the sentence should be of a difficulty level D. So this term basically measures the distance between D and the expected difficulty of the sentence that we have generated so far, Y. So we actually implemented this, but then once we implemented this, we started finding that just simply greedily applying this these scoring functions in the rescoring step in the beam, what it was doing was it was biasing the decoder towards decoding sentences which had difficult words in the earlier steps. So essentially the model was being encouraged to generate difficult words early on for each sentence, and that was clearly a problem. So then we had a couple of simple fixes where we incorporate essentially some kind of future estimates into the decoder. So to score each subsequence y less than t, we would greedily decode the next L steps, and we would combine essentially this constraint satisfaction score with what is the estimated future in terms of satisfaction of each of these constraints. Okay, so that's the trick, and then this works. Okay, so now that we have trained this joint text generation and knowledge tracing model, how do we recommend exercises to students? So in order to do this, we can use some simple recommendation strategies. So one popular strategy is this Expectimax curriculum planning strategy from PEACH 2015. So as per this strategy, what we can do is we can compute the expected knowledge state of the student after practicing this new exercise using our knowledge tracing model. And then we can pick the exercise that maximally improves the student's average knowledge state. Okay, so this is one way of planning the student curriculum. Just picking the exercise that is going to maximally improve the student's average knowledge state according to our model. So here are some bunch of experiments. So we evaluated our model on the Duolingo second language acquisition modeling dataset, the SLAM dataset. So this dataset contains about 1 million interactions of about 2,600 second language learners over the first 30 days of them learning a second language. So this is how this data set looks like. Students are trying to learn languages in typically, here you see Portuguese, and they get a sentence in English and they're trying to translate it in Portuguese. Okay, so here are some results of this approach. So this table here reports various quality measures of exercise generation. So here you see usual text generation metrics like Blue Score and Meteor. But you have some other metrics like coverage of what are the set of knowledge concepts that the system designer wanted. So this is this KC coverage thing. And then finally, we also measure what is the difference between the required and the actual difficulty of the question that is being generated. So on each of these metrics, we see that our adaptive and personalized exercise generation model, which is APEG, does as well or sometimes better than each of these previous baselines that are non-adaptive and not personalized to the student. Here we also see that this kind of joint learning of the knowledge tracing model and the question generation model actually helps. So joint learning is important. And what we did with constrained decoding in particular, using this kind of a look ahead, is actually also important for performance, in particular in terms of difficulty control. So this plot illustrates this importance of using look aheads here in our constrained decoder. So as we can see here in this plot, here I'm plotting essentially the accumulated word difficulty over a set of 2,000 exercise sentences that have been generated by our model. And I divide each of these into the first quarter of sentences, the second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter. And as we can see here, the model here is the model which does not have the look ahead, which is this gray bar here, the one without look ahead, actually begins to generate more and more difficult words early on in the sentence. So the initial word level difficulty, accumulated difficulty, is much higher than the reference in Q1 and Q2, but by incorporating this kind of a look ahead by what the model might generate in the future, actually somewhat mitigates this challenge. So how does this model do potentially in educational settings? So here, I'm going to quickly showcase the potential utility of this kind of a generative model in education with some simulations using our trained knowledge tracing model. So in this plot, we show on the y-axis average predicted students' knowledge state, basically the student's mastery of the vocabulary as the student is practicing more and more exercises. So the x-axis, on the x-axis, you have exercise index. As you go on the right on this plot, the student is practicing more and more exercises. So as we can see here, the Expectimax Gen curriculum, which is basically this curriculum designed by generating questions that lead to the best expected knowledge gain of the student, here leads to higher expected student knowledge state as compared to this Expectimax curriculum, which is this blue plot, which is always selecting the best exercise from a fixed pool, from a pool of exercises, in this case, the training set. So this really shows the benefit of having a generative model which is adaptive in order to improve students' predicted knowledge state. Okay, so overall, to summarize our work on question generation, here we have proposed an approach for personalized and adaptive generation of these translation problems for language learning settings. And in the future, we plan to study how this approach extends to other question types and domains. This is the end of first part of my talk, and I'll be happy to pause for a moment and take any questions.
Any questions from the physical audience? Yes. We need,
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. The first one was about the math word problems that you talked about. When you measure difficulty in that setting, was it just about, so because the underlying pedagogical concept is fixed, was the difficulty in just adding more noise inside the word problems, or the students had to decipher what they have to do?
Yes, so that's a great question. So actually, measuring difficulty in educational domains is a very challenging problem. So what we were doing in that setting was we used this concept called age of acquisition of words, and we were measuring essentially, we were using the difficulty of age of acquisition of all the words that are going to be in the generated problem as some kind of a proxy of problem difficulty. So that is clearly an strong assumption, because problems are not difficult just based on their lexical difficulty, but also in terms of the concepts that are tested.
Yeah, and just a final question. So I know you talked about how personalized learning is supposed to be better for students. There are a lot of studies that were done. But did you try out your text generation approach in Duolingo with actual students? And I know we saw all those nice looking graphs with simulations which had good knowledge gains, but I don't know how it would actually work in practice.
Yeah, that's also a great question. So yeah, we did not. So far, we've not. That's one of the things we hope we'll be able to do someday. But we've not been able to do that yet. And I definitely want to actually highlight the limitations of what I was presenting here. Clearly, using the trained knowledge tracing model to make, we don't want to make strong claims about student learning based on just the knowledge tracing model that itself has been trained on the data we've seen. And in the future, we definitely want to actually be able to conduct these studies to actually test real learning, and that is a significant challenge.
Thank you very much.
We have one question from the virtual audience. It says, how transfer learning can be utilized in question generation based on knowledge tracing?
I see. So that's a great question. So one of the things that, for instance, what I presented today, it does is these pre-trained models have good representations of text, right? They build good contextualized word representations. So they really have some information about text quality, and essentially this model already becomes sample efficient in terms of its generative capabilities by using these pre-trained language models. I guess your question about transfer learning is more broad, and maybe one can at some point also think about transfer learning among students. Maybe one could think about how I could also do transfer learning on the student model, how I could train a model on a set of students, and maybe that might itself be used to generalize to other students, maybe similar students, and that is something a lot of these systems also do. So yeah, so that is definitely another opportunity for future work.
Yes, we have another question from the physical audience.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would love you to go back to the slide where you show the comparison between students and ChatGPT. This slide says a lot because it seems that the ChatGPT is better than students. So the question that is underlying that, is it the good way of teaching students or on understanding if students have really understood the question we are posing them? Because ChatGPT is basically a big memory where you retrieve information. Are we asking the students only to retrieve information with these tests? And so the point is education as it is foreseen now the right way of educating people? Because if we can emulate people with something like a machine, then it is very strange that this is the good way of educating people. Does it make sense for you?
Maybe I'll try to answer this a little bit, and then we can come back and if you have another question. So we are not making any claims or comparisons here between ChatGPT and students so far in this talk. So indeed, if you were to think about it, I think students are going to use ChatGPT or whatever tools that are out there anyway, and maybe instead of thinking about whether this particular model is better than students, maybe we could think about more collaborative mechanisms of how these models can be used with teachers, right? That is sort of what I was talking about here, how we can give teachers some measure of control in terms of what questions they are generating for students. In the second part of the talk, I'll talk about how we can use these models maybe potentially to tutor students, and maybe how we can work through sort of their challenges in these settings. So I do think of this as more of a collaborative effort. Does that answer the question?
Do you have any question? Yeah? No? Okay. Kushita, you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question. It's kind of a clarifying question. So in slide number 23, so you show that vocabulary dimensional vector, which shows the kind of how the student has learned the different words. So I just wanted to know that how do you exactly measure that? So is it like, suppose there are some exercises where that particular word has to be used and the student has answered it correctly. So based on that, you're just measuring that, like he has learned that kind of word or something?
Yes, precisely. So we have historical data of each word's student getting each word correctly, based on the exercises that they have answered so far. And we use it to basically build this representation of students. This is a time-varying representation of students, of each student. And it is essentially a v-dimensional vector. So each position in this vector, the way you can think about this, is a real value between 0 and 1, which tells me whether this particular student has mastered this particular word. Okay. And you can, the way this model typically learns is by defining a very simple kind of a LSTM model, for instance, where the model is trained to predict these student correctness labels. And SN, this student state, is a representation that is learned through this in this model. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I'll move on to the second part of my talk. So in this part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about how we can use these language models maybe a little bit more directly now to tutor students. So instead of working with teachers, now we want to see how these language models can be used in intelligent tutoring contexts. So I'll describe a couple of instances of a couple of works that we have done in this area. So a particular instance of this interaction-based tutoring that we have been looking at is called Socratic sub-question. So Socratic questioning is actually a very old educational method, which has a lot of its foundations in psychology. And it's really best illustrated by this quote that is often attributed to Socrates. So it is believed that Socrates would often ask Plato a set of thought-provoking questions, where each question was essentially designed in a way that would help Plato arrive at the final answer, at the final conclusion. So Socratic questioning has been used as an educational method, as it allows students to self-discover answers to maybe complex problems without really giving them the answer to the complex problem in one go. So here's how we think about this. So in general, the principles of Socratics are not very well defined, and we do not have very good, say, computational models for Socratics in general. But in some of our recent work, we have been trying to build on this, where we have been looking at a particular Socratic approach that is well suited for complex problems, for example, in mathematics. So this approach is called funneling. And the key idea here is to hierarchically generate some set of prompting sub-questions to guide students towards a solution. So for instance, let's say you're given this question, Grace weighs 125 pounds. Alex weighs 2 pounds less than 4 times what Grace weighs. What are their combined weights in pounds? So you could imagine this question being solved like this by a student. Alex weighs 125 into 4 minus 2 is equal to 298 pounds. And then the student might use that and compute the combined weights of Alex and Grace, and by summing up their weights. So you could imagine guiding the student towards the solution by generating a sub-question corresponding to the original problem based on each of these steps in the question, each of the steps corresponding to the solution. So you could ask the student, how much does Alex weigh? And then you could ask them, what is the combined weight of Grace and Alex in pounds? So the hypothesis is that if the student is able to answer these sub-questions, maybe they'd be able to figure out how the original question should be answered. In fact, you could do this, go on and continue to do this. So let's say if the student is not able to answer the first question, how much does Alex weigh? Maybe you can further break it down into a set of sub-questions. You can ask, how much does Grace weigh? And given the weight of Grace, how much does Alex weigh? And so on. What is the relationship between the weight of Grace and Alex? You could continue to decompose the original problem into a set of sub-questions. So what we did is we trained a reinforcement learning-based sub-question generation model with actually rewards coming from a large language model-based solver to generate these set of sub-questions. So I'll just describe this at a very high level because I'm running out of time. So if we think about what is a good sub-questioning scheme, a good sub-questioning scheme should have these two properties. For instance, a good sub-question should be focused. It should be directed towards the content that we are expecting the student to learn. Second, these sub-questions should be goal-driven, right? They should actually assist students in reaching the final answer, being able to solve the original problem. So we incorporate these two properties into a text generation model that essentially looks like this. In this model, we have two parts. On the left, we have a content planner, which is trying to reason about the problem that is given to it. This is an LLM reasoner, essentially, which plans the sub-questions by reasoning about the problem. And then we have a sub-question generator model, which is the second thing that you see in the middle. And this question generator uses this plan and generates these sub-questions. And the question generator is trained with reinforcement learning through basically a set of rewards which measure things like fluency of the question or the granularity of the sub-questions, the number of sub-questions that we are planning to ask, and the answerability of these sub-questions. So here we have a set of rewards that are computed using GPT-3, which are basically answers to these questions. Are the sub-questions that are generated answerable by GPT-3? If the GPT-3 is able to answer that sub-question, maybe that's a good thing. And the second thing is, can the sub-questions guide GPT-3 itself in answering the problem? So if we provide the sub-question as a prompt, is that making it helpful for GPT-3 in answering the problem? So we use these set of rewards to train this question generation model. We trained this model on the GSM 8K dataset, which has about 8,500 math word problems, and corresponding to those problems, also these Socratic sub-questions. And then each problem, the problems in this data set are quite complex. They require essentially 2 to 8 reasoning steps. And they essentially require you doing a set sequence of elementary calculations using a set of maybe basic arithmetic operations. So here is the evaluation of human quality on these sub-questions that we have generated. So we evaluate the quality of sub-question on a set of criteria. Repetition is the first one. This is measuring whether the sub-questions are repeated. Factuality, which is measuring whether the questions are solvable. Logical relevance, if the question is logically even relevant to the original problem. Right sequencing, are the questions sequenced in the right manner? Completeness, which is whether the questions are complete. Are they covering all the steps that are required to reach the final answer? And so on. And fluency, finally. So in these human evaluations, we can see that these generated sub-questions are slightly better. They're not too much better. They're slightly better than the baseline supervised model. So the baseline model here happens to be GPT-2. And we are seeing this difference between GPT-2 and this model, GPT-2 fine-tuned with RL. So then what we did is we used these generated sub-questions and try to do a learning study, trying to mimic a study with learners on mTurk. And here we have these learners who are trying to answer GSM 8K questions on mTurk. And we designed an experiment where we provided these learners who did not answer maybe this math question correctly in their first attempt. We provided some set of learners, a set of treatment learners, with these sub-questions as interventions. And you can see it here. So the treatment group is provided these set of sub-questions, whereas maybe there is another control group which does not see these sub-questions and they're just attempting the question twice. Okay. So this is as close to a learning study we can get to with Mechanical Turk. And here's what we saw. So we did not find any significant overall learning gains here. So we have very small learning gains in problem-solving success. But it reveals a lot of interesting properties, in my opinion, about these large language models. On the x-axis of this plot, you have essentially problem difficulty. So the problems are here sorted based on problem difficulty. So the ones on the right are the hardest, ones on the left are the easiest. This is easiest, is simply measured by the number of steps, maybe. On the y-axis, we report success rate of these Turkers who are trying to answer this question in the second attempt. And what we found was somewhat interesting. So for problems that are fairly easy, the ones on the left, right, for which the question decomposition approach itself works well, this is possibly helpful. So for this, for these easier questions on the left, the treatment group has a higher success rate as compared to the control group. But when you see to the right part of this curve on these much harder questions on which there are several steps that are involved, this actually hurts. So this makes none of the members of the treatment group, they're not even able to solve one of these questions correctly. So this really shows that these sub-questions can also be wrong or misleading. And this plot really shows the challenge in AI in education, right? We really have to be able to think deeply about correctness of these sub-questions and how they might be, when they might be helpful and when they might be actually harmful, when these measures can be harmful in education. So in summary, we have proposed this approach for generating of sub-questions as a way of tutoring, but there are also a lot of challenges. So we would, for instance, you would like to think about how we can verify these generated sub-questions before we use them as these educational scaffolds, and how these sub-questioning schemes can be used more generally, maybe beyond the domain of multi-step mathematics. Okay. So finally, I just quickly highlight some work that we have also been doing in our lab on dialogue-based tutoring. So dialogue-based tutoring is kind of a holy grail of educational NLP, and a number of dialogue-based tutors have been developed in various domains. But there are a number of challenges in this area. These tutors have been very expensive to develop, they require a lot of time, and they're often very narrow, and they're not very pedagogical. So we've been thinking about how we can make these models more pedagogical and how we can incorporate some rich human-like, teacher-like pedagogy into these models. So if we've been thinking about how teachers, for instance, teach in the classroom and how they incorporate a set of rich dialogue strategies. For instance, they could pump information, they might be prompting students, they might be hinting, elaborating on questions. They use a lot of rich strategies in teaching these students. But that is something that does not work with ChatGPT. So in fact, what I did one of these days was I prompted ChatGPT with this dialogue context. So here we have this question, this math word problem. I gave it the answer, and I gave it also an incorrect student solution. I gave it the confusion. And I asked it, and I gave it the student dialogue. So in this case, the student is clearly wrong. It's an incorrect solution. Instruct GPT on the first hand just says that's great work, that sounds correct. So it basically gives a factually incorrect response, incorrect feedback to the student. On the other hand, if we use these GPT 3.5 here, what GPT 3.5 begins to do is it just gives out the entire solution. It leaks the entire solution at once. So these models are not very good at dialogic tutoring again. So what we've been doing is we have this new work where we have crowdsourced dialogue data with these kinds of rich pedagogical features, these dialogue tutoring acts, by putting together expert teachers with students and language models. So we have students, language models that are acting as students, and they are really trying to mimic students, and real teachers recruited on these platforms are now conversing with students and are trying to assist them in problem solving on the GSM 8K data set. So we use this kind of a least to most solution revealing scaffold design, where the teachers are asked to use basically these scaffolding approaches where they ask the student to focus on a particular sub-step of the question, or maybe they are trying to probe the student's knowledge, but they are actually asked to refrain from telling the solution as much as possible. Okay, so here's how this data set looks like. So on the x-axis, we have conversational progress, and on the y-axis, we have fraction of utterances. So so the teachers are asked to actually mostly use probing and focus dialogue acts, but they are asked to actually not tell the solution up until the very end of the solution. So this blue part of this curve, this telling happens at the end of the conversation. The students just don't get it. So here are quick results. So here we see that when we fine-tuned a number of open source language models on this collected data, and we are comparing essentially zero-shot GPT-3 with these fine-tuned language models on this data set. And we can see here that on this metric called equitable tutoring, which is whether the teachers are giving students a learning opportunity, it's giving them a space to reflect, and it's not just giving them the solution away, then on this metric, GPT-3 does very good. It achieves a score of 1.5, where these models fine-tuned on this data set that we have collected begins to show higher equitable tutoring quality and becomes a much better tutor. Okay, so in summary, we've proposed a new data collection approach for collecting rich dialogue tutoring data by pairing teachers with language models playing the role of students. And I think this is quite interesting, and it allows us to make these language models a lot more pedagogical. Okay, so with that, I will end. I want to acknowledge all my wonderful collaborators and students at ETH. All of this is basically their work. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'm happy to take any remaining questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mrinmaya, for an interesting talk. However, we encountered a little network connectivity issue in between. But thank you so much for an interesting talk. We'll now take up questions from both physical and virtual audience. I think we have one question from the virtual audience. I don't know if you have read it before. Now, can all these methodologies be extended to emotion-based conversations to have emotional engagement with users?
I think that's an interesting question. I think emotion is another piece that is very difficult to really quantify or think about here. And clearly, emotional state of the student is another important factor that we must consider. Learning is not about just sort of maximizing for knowledge about some set of criteria, but it's also about motivation. It's about keeping the students motivated and engaged emotionally. So I think that those set of criteria need to also be thought about, and how these language models maybe can be used, or maybe some even simpler methods can be used to actually understand these sort of factors in student learning. I think that would be great. And these are some of the outstanding challenges.
Thank you. We have another question from the virtual audience. How to improve the ability of the model to answer subsequent questions without hallucinating as difficulties of sub-questions raise?
Yeah, so that is very interesting. So these models have this problem of hallucination, right? They tend to sort of they might incorrectly hallucinate some set of facts. They might reason about problems in weird ways. I think there is a lot of work that is going on in this area across the community. I think we could, for instance, think about ways in which we can incorporate verification, either in model fine-tuning, or we could incorporate sort of verification in maybe adaptation or prompting based approaches. We could evaluate these sort of model outputs. We could maybe sample from the model several times, and we could re-rank them and select which one is reasonable based on some set of criteria. Yeah, I think this is something that we are planning to do as well.
Yeah. Any questions from the physical audience? Yes. Oh. Yes. Oh, yes. Just a second.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
I had this doubt regarding your knowledge tracing model. It accounts for word-to-word translation, but what if someone has given a syntactically different response, but semantically it makes the same sense? So how good does your knowledge tracing model works on that? As if it's a sentence translation, and he has given a different response, but semantically it means the same.
I see. Yes. So that's a great question. So, so there are two answers to this. So first of all, we make a set of assumptions. So these sentences are usually fairly simple. So this is And these simple sentences usually have one correct translation. And that is an assumption that is being made here to estimate these word level correctness labels in the data.
Okay.
And that has been done during creation of the SLAM data set itself.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's part of the answer. But there are, of course, a lot of limitations in general, what you're pointing out. We, for instance, use only word level mastery as skills, whereas clearly mastering syntax is a very important part of language understanding.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, we have Dr. Saptarshi Ghosh from IIT Kharagpur here.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello, Mrinmaya. Yeah. Thanks for a very wonderful talk. So this is a slightly maybe a philosophical question. So since your ultimate goal is to generate dialogues, so I mean, is it preferable that, say, a model like ChatGPT initially gives some wrong answers, which is then corrected, that leads to maybe a longer dialogue, than say it directly giving the correct answer every time?
So I believe there might have been a misunderstanding. So what we want here is that we want such a dialogue tutor to actually not tell student the solution immediately, but ask them some set of maybe thought-provoking questions. So for instance, if you see here the top two categories, focusing and probing, they have a set of intent, like where they are seeking the student for what is the strategy that they might employ when they might think about answering this question. They might focus them into some part of the question with some relevant information. They might ask them for an explanation, maybe some kind of self-correction, maybe some contrastive example. What would you do if it was these many items instead? Or maybe seeking some piece of word knowledge that might be missing as part of this. So the objective here is to have a tutor that, instead of just giving away the solution, asks students thought-provoking questions that can guide learning, right? That can really help them learn. And eventually, sometimes this dialogue might fail. Our teachers actually end up not being able to make GPT-3 being able to answer this question. So at that point, they are asked allow them to actually tell the student GPT-3 the answer.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Yeah, it's a very interesting work. Thanks.
Any more questions, anyone? So I think we'll wrap this up. Thank you, Dr. Mrinmaya, for your time and support for this event. It was really wonderful having you here. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I think we have a break now and we'll start again from 3 p.m. BST. Thank you everyone for joining and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.